Just because it's gluten-free doesn't mean that it's not going to cause a problem in a different area. We have to be able to take a broader scale look at this. So what I'm going to address here is the worst kinds of gluten-free flours and foods that you can consume, the best kind, and then how you might want to possibly go about reintroducing gluten if you are not celiac. So I understand that there are issues with gluten, okay, period, whether it's a celiac related issue or not. Because where the evidence starts to come in is there's something called a prolamin, which is a storage protein that is in all kinds of grains and things like that. What happens are peptides that are released from these prolamins, from these storage proteins, when they enter our body, they can trigger an immune system effect similar to that in which someone with celiac would encounter. Now, that being said, someone with celiac could still consume some form of gluten-free compound and still have a flare-up. And the reason is because these prolamine storage proteins can release a peptide which will trigger the same immune response that'll cast an attack on your body. Now, this is an area that is still being heavily looked at, right? We can't say with absolute certainty that aside from celiac, gluten is the absolute issue. However, there's starting to be some interesting evidence with thyroid, with Hashimoto, things like that, that once again, gluten could play a role. So it probably has to do more than anything with the autoimmune response and what's happening there. So let's go ahead and break this down. After today's video, I popped a link down below for 25% off of Seed's Daily Synbiotic. So a 25% discount off of what's called their Synbiotic. This is a probiotic and a prebiotic in one capsule. Seed does a lot of their own research. They publish their own clinicals on this stuff, so they put their money where their mouth is. But when it comes down to adding a probiotic in, this is the only probiotic I've ever added into my diet where I've noticed it within about a week. Noticeable changes in personally my appetite, my energy levels, but people that I talk to also, I get emails all the time of people saying that this has changed them. Like it really does work. And that 25% off discount link, you can't really beat. So that link is down below in the top line of the description underneath this video. If you're making a diet change, it's probably one of the better things to implement in. Without getting into a lot of detail of autoimmune issues and things like that, let's just talk about the grains in and of themselves. Okay, I want to address rice first. If you're gluten-free, then you know that a lot of the things that you're consuming are going to be made with rice flour. What we have to understand is that refined rice flour, although gluten-free, could be very, very inflammatory because it's so high glycemic. And when you start looking at the research compared to other flours, rice flour becomes a big issue. It increases postprandial glucose levels quite significantly, which can lead to higher levels of inflammation, which can lead to worse flare-ups of whatever issues you're having. So over time, you might notice that the more and more rice flour you're consuming as a gluten-free option, you might not be getting the same positive effect. You don't feel as good anymore. So one of the things that I recommend that people do if they're really trying to figure out what grains they can consume, there's sort of a hierarchy that you could sort of follow. First off, rather than just having rice flour all the time, I definitely recommend you try millet, and I recommend that you try buckwheat. Okay, millet flour, the darker the millet, the better. Okay, because darker millet contains something called ferulic acid, which can actually modulate inflammation quite a bit. Now, millet is already gluten-free, but the thing with millet is because it has so much in the way of what are called non-starch polysaccharides, it really does change the microbiome of the gut quite a bit. And we're starting to see that some of the issues that people have, even with gluten, are actually a gut integrity and a microbiome issue. So millet having these non-starch polysaccharides, you can cook with millet better than you can with buckwheat because buckwheat is pretty dense and heavy in fiber, so you can't get that same elevation if you were baking with it. But millet you can do a decent amount with. Okay, so the darker the millet, the better. And the interesting thing is if you're diabetic or insulin resistant, there's interesting research showing subjects consuming millet for 90 days, they ended up having a 19% reduction in their HbA1c. That's huge over 90 days, so something's happening there. And it probably has to do with, once again, the non-starch polysaccharides remodeling the gut and possibly this ferulic acid. So I recommend you try switching over that a little bit, especially if you're baking at home, but there are lots of foods that are containing millet now. Okay, then obviously there's going to be buckwheat. You want to go that option whenever possible, but buckwheat is great simply because it's a higher fiber content and has some other compounds in it. It's just not practical. Otherwise we'd see more stuff baked with it. Now, if you're trying to slowly introduce gluten to test things out, you've probably heard this before, but the main thing you want to try is you want to try sourdough. And I would recommend making your own sourdough. And it's one of those things where if you are really concerned with your health and you're really concerned about this gluten thing and you want to figure it out, I don't want to hear from you that, oh, well, I don't have the time to go make sourdough, or I don't have the time, or I don't have the money to spend a couple. It's not expensive. It takes a little bit of time. But if you get a sourdough starter, you can make your own sourdough and you can test it out yourself, because the fermentation process, in theory, should break down some of the prolamin walls, and it should break down some of those proteins that would normally cause an issue with that gluten, that gliadin, that whole response within your body. I do not recommend you attempt sourdough if you are celiac, though. That's too much of a risk. But I would recommend that you try sourdough if you're just concerned if gluten is even a problem. Okay, for years and years and years, we kept gluten out of our diet, and we still do within our family. But occasionally, sourdough, if it's made from scratch, is something that we will accept because of the fermentation process and how it breaks things down. So that's a really good test to see, because you're at that point, you're consuming gluten technically. Okay, and if you still feel okay after consuming sourdough, then it probably so much isn't the gluten, it's probably some other issues that are going on there. Now, outside of that, the next one that you would want to try is you'd want to try barley. Now, the reason that barley is granted a little bit of amnesty, even though it has gluten, is because it has an interesting way of elevating what's called glucagon-like peptide 1. Okay, so GLP-1 is a gut incretin. Okay, so it's released when we consume certain foods. It's released when we are satiated, when we're full, and it does communicate with our brain to say, hey, this person's done eating, don't make them eat anymore, don't make them hungry. But additionally, it has like post-food effects. And what I mean by that is it modulates glucose, and if our GLP-1 levels are elevated the way they should be, a lot of our hormones and a lot of our energy fuels sort of become stabilized. Okay, that's what's interesting about GLP-1. We're even seeing in diabetic patients, like they're literally giving like GLP-1 analogs and semaglutide. These are things that affect GLP-1 because we're seeing it's so powerful. So there's a study published in the British Journal of Nutrition that took a look at just this. They gave subjects barley versus wheat for 4 days, and after 3 days, there was a 56% increase in fasting GLP-1 levels. Remember, GLP-1 is usually elevated after we eat, so the fact that it was 56% higher when fasted shows that it was having a positive effect. What does this have to do for you and your gluten issues? Well, a lot of times with gluten issues, whether you're celiac or you just are sensitive to it, there's other things at play. Metabolic syndrome, metabolic derangement of some kind. And if you can start modulating glucose and you can start elevating GLP-1, that seems to be a regulator of a lot of metabolic and energy system functions. So what that means is by introducing this, not only can you test out if you can handle a little bit of gluten, but you also might start to kind of balance things out a little bit more. Now, obviously you want to avoid the wheat, you want to avoid the rye and things like that. So in this order, you can start to kind of add things in. Okay, switch over to the buckwheat, try adding the millet in and see how that feels, even though those have gluten. Try building your own sourdough and testing a small amount. And you really do want to start small. You want to start with like a half a slice, and you want to do it with nothing else on it. Okay, you don't want to be putting butter on toast. You want to try like a half a slice of sourdough and see how you feel even on an empty stomach. And it probably goes without saying, but I should say this anyway. This does not give you a license to go eat bread. I think if having a gluten phobia is what's keeping you away from bread, then fine, keep the gluten phobia, because it's probably better you're afraid of gluten than eating loaves of bread per day. But I don't want you putting the cart before the horse and just choosing rice flour gluten options when they could be just as bad for you metabolically, just because you're concerned about this underlying other issue that's going on. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.